The sound of murmuring filled the packed university auditorium as Mark Walker, a war veteran decorated with multiple commendations, walked onto the stage. His neatly pressed uniform caught the overhead lights, a stark contrast to the casual attire of the young students shifting in their seats. Mark adjusted the microphone, his stoic demeanor masking his nerves. The event, billed as a leadership seminar, had unexpectedly become a battlefield of its own. The title of the viral video that sparked the controversy replayed in his mind. Woke college students mock a soldier. It was only days old, yet it had turned his life upside down. Among the scattered applause, a group of students, sitting near the front row, remained stone-faced. At their center was Lila Bradford, her piercing gaze locked onto Mark. She didn't clap. Instead, she crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, exuding defiance. To her and her peers, Mark wasn't a leader to be admired. He was the embodiment of a system they had vowed to dismantle. Mark noticed their expressions, but pressed on. He began his speech with the same measured tone he had used during countless briefings overseas. Leadership isn't about power. It's about sacrifice. Lila's hand shot up almost immediately, cutting him off mid-sentence. Sacrifice for what? She challenged, her voice sharp and clear. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some wide with surprise, others nodding in approval. You talk about sacrifice like it's noble, but whose sacrifices are we talking about? Soldiers like you, or the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of wars they didn't ask for? Mark paused, his grip tightening on the podium. It's a fair question, he replied, his tone calm but firm. Sacrifice is never easy, and yes, it's complicated. But the men and women I served with gave everything to protect people they didn't even know. That's the kind of leadership I'm talking about. He shifted his weight, his voice steady but carrying an edge. I've seen lives saved because of those sacrifices. Lives that might have been lost if we hadn't been there. Lila wasn't satisfied. She stood, her posture rigid. And what about the lives lost because you were there? Her voice rose, echoing in the cavernous room. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Mark met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He could feel the tension thickening around him. The divide in the room was palpable. Some students frowned at Lila's audacity, while others nodded in agreement. As the confrontation escalated, a student from Lila's group threw a paper cup. The iced coffee splattered across Mark's uniform, staining the ribbons on his chest. A collective gasp erupted, followed by a stunned silence. Mark froze, his eyes flickering between the student who had thrown the cup and Lila, who looked equally shocked, but quickly masked it with a defiant glare. Mark reached for a handkerchief from his pocket and calmly wiped the liquid from his uniform. This, he said, his voice cutting through the silence, is why leadership is so important. In the face of disrespect, you stay composed. You rise above. He stepped back from the podium, his voice faltering slightly as he added, "You might not agree with me, but I fought for your right to speak your mind, just like this." The audience was a mix of stunned silence and scattered applause as Mark finished his speech. He left the stage without looking back, his shoulders stiff but head held high. As he exited, he caught a glimpse of Lila, her confident mask cracking ever so slightly. For a moment, her eyes seemed to convey something other than anger, confusion, maybe even doubt. Later that evening, as Mark sat alone in his small apartment, his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The video of the protest had gone viral, the title sensational. Woke college students mock a soldier in public. Clips of the drink-throwing incident were everywhere, accompanied by debates and outrage on both sides. Meanwhile, in her dorm room, Lila typed furiously, her blog post a mix of defiance and personal pain. This isn't about disrespecting a soldier. It's about challenging the systems they represent. Both Mark and Lila, in their own ways, felt the weight of the world's gaze. The scent of fresh-cut hay lingered in the summer air as a young Mark Walker sprinted barefoot across the dusty field behind his house. His hometown was a forgotten dot on the map, a place where ambitions rarely stretched beyond the factory gates. Mark's father, a weathered man with calloused hands, had spent his entire life in that factory. Duty isn't about what you want, son, he often said, cigarette smoke curling between his words. It's about what you owe. Mark absorbed the lessons, but the spark of something greater smoldered within him. That spark was fanned into a flame by his best friend, David Lawson, a boy with boundless energy and an infectious laugh. David's dream of joining the military wasn't just a goal, it was his calling. "We could be more than this, Mark," he'd say, lying on the grass under a sky crowded with stars. "We can make a difference." For Mark, who admired David's courage but lacked his certainty, those words planted a seed. By the time they turned 18, David had convinced him. They would enlist together, leave the small town behind, and carve their place in the world. Boot camp was a rude awakening for Mark, who quickly discovered that grit and determination weren't enough to make the cut. David, however, thrived, leading their unit through grueling drills and endless marches. "You've got to toughen up, Walker," David would tease, pulling him up after a particularly brutal obstacle course. "What's the point of leaving home if you're not ready to fight for something?" David's confidence became Mark's lifeline. Slowly but surely, Mark transformed from a hesitant recruit into a disciplined soldier. He began to see the purpose in the pain, the strength in the struggle. Their first deployment thrust them into the harsh realities of war, a world far removed from the idealism they'd shared under the stars. Stationed in a conflict-ridden village, Mark's unit faced daily threats: sniper fire, IEDs, and the constant pressure of protecting civilians. Mark found himself drawn to the children who peeked curiously from behind ruined walls, their innocence a stark contrast to the chaos around them. David, ever the optimist, kept the unit's spirits high. "Remember why we're here," he'd say. "It's about them, not us." The pivotal moment came during a routine patrol that turned into a nightmare. Lila Bradford sat on the worn couch of her cramped apartment, the hum of distant traffic seeping through the cracked window. She stared at the laptop screen, rereading her speech for tomorrow's protest. The words were sharp, unyielding, and filled with purpose, but doubt gnawed at her. Outside, the streets of her urban neighborhood pulsed with life, a chaotic mix of resilience and hardship she knew all too well. Growing up here had taught her one thing: survival wasn't guaranteed, and the system wasn't built for people like her. Her older brother, Jason, had been her anchor. 8 years her senior, Jason was her protector, her confidant, and her hero. When their father walked out and their mother juggled 2 jobs to keep the lights on, Jason became the man of the house. "Don't worry, Lil," he'd say, brushing off her tears. "I'll make sure we're okay." And he tried. But poverty doesn't loosen its grip easily. When recruiters came to their high school promising adventure, honor, and a steady paycheck, Jason saw a way out. Jason's decision to enlist felt like both a sacrifice and a betrayal. Lila was just 10 years old when he left for boot camp, and she clung to the memory of his confident smile as he boarded the bus. But when he returned years later, Jason wasn't the same. Deployment had taken its toll. He spoke less, drank more, and his temper, once so even, flared unpredictably. Lila didn't understand the words PTSD then, but she understood the shattered man who struggled to keep his promises. The night Jason died was etched in her memory like a scar. He had been spiraling for months, drowning in addiction and despair. When the police were called to their neighborhood, responding to a disturbance involving Jason, Lila had begged them to go easy on him. "He's a veteran," she'd said, her voice trembling. "He just needs help." But the system didn't see Jason as a hero. They saw a threat. The confrontation escalated, and before the night was over, Jason was dead, shot in the street he had once walked her down to school. Jason's death shattered Lila's world. In her grief, she found anger, and in that anger, she found purpose. She immersed herself in activism, vowing to fight the injustices that had taken her brother. Her speeches became fiery, her protests louder. But the deeper she dove into her cause, the more she realized the cost. Activism wasn't just about righteous fury. It was about persistence, strategy, and sacrifice. And sometimes, it was about alienating people who didn't see the world the way she did. At the university, Lila became a leader in her activist group. To her peers, she was bold and unflinching, the kind of person who didn't just demand change, but forced it. Yet cracks were forming. Some members questioned their tactics, arguing that confrontation without dialogue alienated potential allies. Lila dismissed their concerns, convinced that her unyielding stance was the only way to honor Jason's memory. But in quiet moments, when the chants faded and the crowds dispersed, doubt crept in. Was she really making a difference? Or was she just yelling into the void? Her distrust of authority was deeply rooted. She remembered the recruiters who filled their high school gym with promises of adventure and purpose, preying on kids who had no other options. She thought of policymakers who turned a blind eye to neighborhoods like hers, where opportunity was scarce, but policing was abundant. And she thought of Jason, who had given everything to a country that had given him nothing in return. These memories fueled her resolve as she wrote her speech for Mark Walker's visit. To Lila, Mark wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol. His uniform, his medals, his accolades, all reminders of a system she believed perpetuated violence and oppression. She crafted her words carefully, each sentence designed to challenge, provoke, and dismantle the narrative she felt he represented. Yet, as she rehearsed her lines in front of the mirror, she noticed the cracks in her armor. Her public defiance hid a private uncertainty. She didn't hate Mark. She hated what he symbolized. But was she ready to confront the man behind the uniform? That night, Lila scrolled through social media, the protest already drawing attention even before it began. Some commenters praised her for her courage, calling her a voice for the voiceless. Others called her disrespectful, entitled, and ignorant. She closed the laptop, her hands trembling. The polarization wasn't new, but it stung all the same. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind drifted to Jason. "Am I doing this right?" she whispered to the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. The article by Evan Ross hit the internet like a spark in a dry forest. Titled A Protest of Pain, 2 stories, 1 stage, it delved into the motivations of both Mark Walker and Lila Bradford with unflinching honesty. Evan didn't take sides, but painted a picture of 2 people shaped by loss, each carrying scars that shaped their beliefs. Readers couldn't help but see themselves in the raw humanity of Mark's and Lila's stories. Soon, the comment sections were buzzing, not with insults, but with a growing demand. Let them talk. Mark read the article with a furrowed brow. He wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated or exposed. It was strange to see his life dissected for public consumption. But what unsettled him more was the call for a dialogue. A dialogue, he muttered, pacing his modest apartment. What's the point? She's not interested in listening. Still, the soldier in him, the man trained to confront challenges head-on, couldn't ignore the pull. After days of deliberation, he agreed to meet Lila. If nothing else, he thought, he could correct the misconceptions about his service. Lila's reaction to the article was less conflicted, though no less emotional. A dialogue? She scoffed during a meeting with her activist group. They want me to sit across from him and pretend the military isn't complicit in everything we fight against. Yet, deep down, she felt something she couldn't name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of doubt. She agreed, framing it as an opportunity to challenge Mark directly. But privately, she prepared herself for what she assumed would be an exercise in frustration. The meeting was arranged at a neutral venue, a university lecture hall cleared of students and distractions. Mark arrived first, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Lila walked in moments later, carrying the weight of her convictions like armor. Neither smiled. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 2 worlds colliding in silence. Finally, Evan Ross, who had been asked to moderate, broke the tension. "Let's begin," he said softly, gesturing for them to sit. Mark went first, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. He spoke of his service, not as a glory story, but as a tale of loss and resilience. "I didn't join the military because I wanted to fight," he said, his hands clenched. "I joined because I wanted to protect people. But war changes you. I lost friends. I lost pieces of myself." He shared the story of David, his best friend, his brother in arms, who died saving others. The memory was fresh, the guilt evident in his voice. Every day, I asked myself if it was worth it. Lila listened, her arms crossed and her expression tight, but something in her softened. When it was her turn, her words came out sharp, laced with years of grief and anger. She spoke of Jason, his dreams, his struggles, and how the system that had promised him a future had left him broken. He gave everything, she said, her voice cracking. And when he came home, he was treated like he didn't matter, like he was disposable. Her eyes glistened, but her tone remained defiant. How can you defend that? For a moment, the room felt too small for their pain. Mark didn't flinch from her anger, but met it with quiet resolve. I don't defend it, he said. What happened to your brother is wrong. It's not what I fought for. He leaned forward, his voice firm. But have you ever talked to the people you criticize? Have you heard their stories? Their struggles? Lila stiffened, ready to retort, but Mark pressed on. Come with me to a veteran center. Hear them out. Then tell me if you still think we're the enemy. Lila hesitated. The idea of stepping into a space filled with soldiers, the very people she had spent years protesting against, felt like crossing enemy lines. But Jason's face flashed in her mind. The way he used to talk about his fellow soldiers, the camaraderie that had once brought him joy. Reluctantly, she agreed. Fine, she said, her tone guarded. But don't expect me to change my mind. The Veteran Center was nothing like Lila expected. It was warm, unpretentious, and filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. Mark introduced her to a few veterans, each with a story that defied stereotypes. One was a single mother who had served to provide for her kids. Another was a man from her own city who spoke openly about his struggles with addiction and homelessness after his deployment. They didn't ask for pity, only understanding. For the first time, Lila saw the humanity behind the uniform. As the visit drew to a close, an older man approached Lila with something in his hands, a weathered journal. Your brother left this here, he said softly. He used to come by sometimes looking for help. Lila's breath caught as she took the journal, her hands trembling. She opened it to find Jason's handwriting, each page a window into his mind. There were entries about his pride in serving, his struggles with PTSD, and his frustration with a society that seemed to forget him. Tears blurred her vision as she read his words. That night, Lila sat alone in her apartment, the journal open on her lap. Jason's words were raw, vulnerable, and deeply human. For the first time, she saw the complexity of his feelings about his service. He wasn't just a victim of a broken system. He was a man who had found moments of purpose and camaraderie in the chaos. Lila began to question her approach. Had her activism honored Jason's memory, or had it reduced him to a symbol of her own anger? Mark, too, spent the evening reflecting. Meeting Lila had challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. Her anger wasn't baseless. It was rooted in experiences he couldn't ignore. He realized he had been too quick to dismiss activists like her, assuming they were simply uninformed. But now he saw her grief, her passion, and her determination to create change. It wasn't so different from his own. The buzz of Lila's phone became a constant reminder of the division her actions had created. What are you even doing, Lila? Asked Jenna, one of her closest allies in the activist group. We're out here fighting for change, and you're hanging out with soldiers? Do you know how that looks? Lila opened her mouth to defend herself, but faltered. She had expected some backlash, but the accusation of selling out stung deeply. Torn between her growing empathy for the veterans and her loyalty to the movement, she struggled to reconcile the two. At the Veterans Center, Mark faced his own backlash. A former Marine named Kyle cornered him one afternoon. What the hell are you doing parading our pain around like a prop? Kyle's words were laced with bitterness. You think talking to some activist is going to change anything? We've been forgotten for years. Mark tried to explain that he wasn't looking for sympathy, only understanding, but Kyle's anger was unrelenting. Good intentions don't fix anything, Walker, he snapped, leaving Mark shaken and questioning whether this effort was worth the strain. As their private struggles unfolded, the media frenzy grew louder. News outlets debated whether the dialogue between Mark and Lila was a step toward healing or a naive attempt to bridge an unbridgeable divide. Social media was a battlefield, with hashtags like hashtag traitor to the cause and hashtag hero or villain trending side by side. Both Mark and Lila felt the weight of public scrutiny, their actions dissected by strangers who knew nothing of their personal battles. The pressure to take a definitive stand loomed large. Then came the discovery that shook them both. While researching Jason's service records, Lila learned he had served in the same unit as David, Mark's best friend. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, reopening wounds she thought she had begun to heal. Confronting Mark, her voice trembled with a mix of anger and grief. "You knew my brother," she accused, her eyes blazing. "You were there, and you didn't save him. How could you let him die?" Mark, stunned by the accusation, struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know," Mark said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't even realize Jason was your brother. If I had," he stopped himself, knowing excuses wouldn't help. "I'm sorry, Lila. I truly am. But I wasn't there when it happened. If I could go back, I would have done anything to save him." His sincerity didn't immediately soften Lila's anger, but the rawness in his voice gave her pause. To ease the tension, Mark shared something he rarely talked about: David's last letter, written just days before his death. The letter spoke of unity and forgiveness, of a hope that people could one day look past labels to see the humanity in each other. David believed in a better world, Mark said quietly. He believed we all have to fight for it in whatever way we can. Lila read the letter in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she saw the weight Mark carried, and it mirrored her own. Jason's death, Lila realized, wasn't Mark's fault. It was part of a larger, broken system that failed to protect its own. But accepting this truth didn't come easily. Her anger had been a shield for so long, and lowering it left her feeling vulnerable. Still, the cracks in her resentment began to widen. As she reread Jason's journal that night, she focused on an entry where he wrote about his hopes for a world where veterans and civilians understood each other. "Maybe we're not so different," he had written. The words stayed with her. Meanwhile, Mark prepared for the public reconciliation event with a heavy heart. The idea of standing on a stage, bearing his soul to an audience that might still judge him, felt overwhelming. But he also knew this was bigger than him. If even one person left the event with a better understanding of the complexities of service and activism, it would be worth it. He thought of David's letter and Jason's journal, drawing strength from their shared hope for unity. Lila's doubts persisted as the event approached. Could she truly stand beside Mark without betraying her cause? Her activist group was divided, with some members urging her to back out and others supporting her decision to speak. But as she reread Jason's journal one last time, she found clarity. His words were a reminder of why she had started her fight in the first place. Not to sow division, but to seek justice and understanding. With a deep breath, she resolved to face the crowd alongside Mark, even if it meant facing backlash. The venue buzzed with anticipation, the room packed with reporters, students, veterans, and activists. Cameras flashed as Mark and Lila sat side by side, their expressions unreadable but their mutual tension palpable. Mark adjusted the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. For a moment, he thought about backing out, but then he remembered David's words. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Mark said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'm not standing here as a hero or an enemy. I'm just a man who made choices, some good, some bad, all of them human." He paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with veterans and protesters alike. "I've seen the cost of war, on soldiers, on civilians, and yes, on those we leave behind. But tonight isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding." Mark shared stories from his service, not the triumphs, but the raw, painful moments. He recounted the civilians he'd saved and the ones he couldn't, the comrades he'd lost, and the scars, both visible and hidden, that followed him home. "When I enlisted, I wanted to make a difference. But the truth is, I don't know if I've always done that," he admitted, his voice breaking. "What I do know is that every soldier carries a piece of the battlefield with them. And sometimes that weight is too much to bear." The audience was silent, captivated by Mark's vulnerability. Even Lila found herself moved, despite the walls she had built around her heart. When he finished, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants nervously, and gestured for her to take the stage. The weight of the moment hit her like a tidal wave, but she stood, clutching Jason's journal tightly, and faced the crowd. "I wasn't sure if I could do this," Lila began, her voice shaking. "I've spent most of my life angry, at the system, at authority, at people like Mark." She glanced at him, her expression softening. But that anger wasn't just about what was wrong with the world. It was about my brother, Jason. Her voice faltered, but she pushed forward. He was a soldier like Mark. He believed in something bigger than himself. But when he came home, he was broken, and the world he fought for didn't fight for him. The audience stirred some nodding in understanding. Lila opened Jason's journal, her hands trembling. "I didn't realize until recently that Jason carried his own guilt, his own pain. And tonight, I want to share something he wrote about Mark." Her voice cracked as she read aloud. "Today, I saw something extraordinary. One of my unit's men risked his life to save a family caught in the crossfire. I don't know his name, but watching him reminded me why I joined. For a moment, I believed again." Mark froze, his mind racing. He had no idea Jason had been there that day. The memory of the mission flooded back, dragging a terrified mother and her children out of harm's way, the searing heat of the explosion that killed David, the chaos that followed. Jason had been watching? The weight of the revelation hit him like a blow. Tears welled in his eyes as Lila continued. "He never told me this," Lila said, her voice breaking. "I've spent so much time blaming Mark and soldiers like him, but my brother, he admired Mark. He saw hope in what he did." She lowered the journal, her tears flowing freely. "I've been so angry, so consumed by grief, that I lost sight of what Jason wanted. For me, for all of us. He wanted us to fight for a better world, yes, but not through hate, through understanding." The room was silent for a moment. Then a wave of emotion rippled through the crowd. Mark stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know Jason, but I wish I had. From what I've learned, he was a brave, honorable man. And if he saw something good in me that day, then I'll do everything I can to honor that." He extended his hand to Lila, his eyes pleading for a truce. Lila hesitated, the weight of her anger and guilt still heavy. But as she looked at Mark, she saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being, burdened by his own pain. She took his hand, and the crowd erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, but in that moment, it felt like a release for Mark, for Lila, and perhaps even for Jason and David. In the weeks following the public event, Mark and Lila found themselves at the center of an unlikely alliance. What began as a tentative truce blossomed into collaboration. They sat together at community meetings, brainstorming ways to bridge the gaps between veterans and activists. "We're not here to erase each other's pain," Lila often said, "but to find where our stories meet." Mark, still uneasy in the public eye, nodded in agreement, letting her words carry the weight they both felt. Their first project was simple but powerful, organizing a series of open forums where veterans and activists could share their experiences without judgment. The first event drew a small crowd, but the stories shared were raw and transformative. A young veteran spoke about his struggles with reintegration, while a college student admitted to dismissing soldiers without understanding their sacrifices. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Inspired by the success, Lila redirected her activism toward mental health reform, a cause she had avoided in the past because it felt too personal. She worked tirelessly to shed light on systemic failures that affected both veterans like her brother and civilians in underserved communities. Her speeches, once fiery and confrontational, became measured and deeply empathetic. "Anger can ignite change," she told a crowd at one rally, "but empathy sustains it." Mark, meanwhile, found renewed purpose in mentoring younger veterans. He joined a local program that paired retired soldiers with those struggling to adjust to civilian life. One mentee, a 22-year-old named Jake, reminded him of himself. Idealistic but haunted. "You're not alone," Mark told him during their first session. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Jake's gratitude affirmed what Mark had begun to believe, that his pain could be a bridge, not a barrier. Evan Ross, ever the chronicler of these unlikely transformations, published his final piece on the controversy, The Soldier and the Activist. The article painted an intimate portrait of Mark and Lila's journey, weaving together their pasts, their losses, and their shared commitment to change. It wasn't a story about heroism or villainy, but about two flawed, determined people finding common ground. The piece went viral, sparking nationwide conversations about reconciliation and understanding. Not everyone embraced Lila's new direction. Some of her activist peers accused her of abandoning their cause or diluting their message. "You're working with the enemy," one of them said during a tense meeting. Lila held her ground, though the criticism stung. "If we're serious about change," she replied, "we can't see each other as enemies." That's how nothing gets done. Over time, some came to respect her approach, while others drifted away. Mark, too, faced challenges as he navigated his new role. At a veterans event, an older soldier confronted him. "You're wasting your time with those people," he said, referring to the activists. Mark stood firm, replying, "They're not just those people. They've suffered losses too, just like us. We're all fighting the same fight in different ways." The exchange left Mark shaken, but more resolute than ever. Amid their public efforts, Mark and Lila found moments of personal healing. Lila visited her family more often, sharing Jason's journal with her mother, who wept as she read his words. "He was so proud of you," her mother said, holding Lila's hand. Mark, on the other hand, reconnected with his younger sister, Emily. For years, she had idolized him from a distance, too intimidated to ask about his experiences. One night, over coffee, Mark opened up, telling her about David, Jason, and his struggles with guilt. Emily hugged him tightly. "You're not just my hero," she said. "You're my brother." As the months passed, Mark and Lila's efforts began to ripple beyond their immediate community. Schools invited them to speak about empathy and civic engagement. Politicians reached out, seeking their insights on veteran care and systemic reform. Mark often joked that he hadn't signed up to be a public figure, but Lila would smile and remind him, "You're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who's ever felt unseen." On the anniversary of David's death, Mark visited his grave for the first time in years. He knelt before the headstone, feeling a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Taking a deep breath, he placed a folded note beside the flowers he had brought. "We're making a difference, brother," it read. "You'd be proud." As he stood, he felt lighter, as if a part of the burden he had carried for so long had lifted.